there's a lot to be cynical about in life. Dr. Boyd mentioned two, crummy politicians and global terror. And actually that video is a couple years old, but if you fast forward years later, I mean, what do we got going on in the news today? Crummy politicians making grandiose promises. And even this past week, we had an act of terror in Belgium. So there's a lot to be cynical about, both in the world and in our own lives and our own experiences. Last week, I sat down and had coffee with a member of our church, and I was just talking about, what brought you here originally? And he started telling me the story of this experience before Believers Fellowship, and had spent years pouring into ministry at another church only to be betrayed by the pastor, who was also a good friend of his. And found out that the guy was living a double life, and then later the pastor absconded with the church's money, and there was this huge mess left in his wake. And that's just one person's story. There are a myriad of other stories here in this room right now. Stories of abuse, stories of abandonment, stories of betrayal, stories of failures and broken dreams. You probably have a story. There's a lot to be cynical about in life. But I love what Greg Boyd said in that video. He said, even if you have a million things to be cynical about, if you have one thing to be genuinely hopeful about, you can be an optimist. And we do have that one thing, because the tomb is empty and Jesus is alive. Now, today we're going to talk about the first Easter story. That's the one thing that we have hopeful about, one thing that we have to be hopeful about. And we're going to look at the story of Jesus' disciples on that original Easter, one disciple in particular, and that is Thomas. And eventually we're going to be in John chapter 20, but our story begins in John chapter 11. So go ahead and turn in your Bibles to John chapter 11. Now, in John 11, Jesus is across the Jordan River away from Judea because the religious leaders in Judea are trying to kill him because he's claiming to be the Son of God. Well, in John 11, Jesus hears that his good friend Lazarus is like moments away from death. And his family asks him to come to them, and they're hoping that he will be able to heal Lazarus. But the problem is that Lazarus lived in Bethany, which is really close to Jerusalem, which was like the seatbed of all of this hostility and opposition to Jesus. And so for Jesus to return to Bethany would be a lot like Edward Snowden, like coming back to the United States and walking in to the front door of the CIA headquarters, right? Probably not the smartest thing to do if he wanted to remain a free man. But Lazarus was Jesus' friend, and Jesus cared about him, and he knew he was going to raise him from the dead, and so he decided to go to Bethany anyway. Now, the disciples, understandably, opposed this. They thought it was too dangerous, but Jesus insisted. And so I want to look at what Jesus had to say to them, and then also, specifically, I want to focus on Thomas's response. So we're in John 11, and I want to start reading in verse 11. Now, after saying these things, he said to them, "Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him." Well, the disciples said to him, "Well, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover." Now, Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he was talking about taking a rest in sleep. So then Jesus told them plainly, "Friends, Lazarus has died, and for your sake, I'm glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." And now here's Thomas's response. And so Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Notice Thomas's attitude there. He says, let's go with Jesus so that we will die with him. Now, in Thomas's mind, Jesus' trip to Bethany and eventually Jerusalem, can only end one of two ways. Either Jesus on the throne with his disciples seated at his left hand and his right hand, or with all of them dead. But Thomas, he's ready to roll, right? He believes in Jesus. He believes he's the Messiah. He's ready to see him on the throne, and he's ready to die to make that happen. And there's even a little bit of a hint of him encouraging his fellow disciples and challenging them along, as if he's saying to them, come on, guys, every man dies, not every man truly lives. Something like that, That's his mentality of going back to Bethany. Thomas was young and idealistic. He had absolute confidence in God and faith that Jesus was who he said he was. He wasn't afraid to follow Jesus to Bethany, to Jerusalem, even to death. He's ready to die for what he believed. Now to Thomas, life was simple. And the stories always ended with the good guys winning, right? It always ended with the dragon being slain and the handsome prince and the beautiful princess getting married and living happily ever after, right? Do you remember when you believed that? Well, we know how this story really went, right? Jesus, he went to Bethany. He raised Lazarus from the dead. He hung out with Lazarus' family for a little bit. He celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples. He gave the Upper Room Discourse, which we just did a sermon series in. And then immediately after that, he was arrested. He was convicted. He was beaten. He was humiliated. And he was crucified. And Thomas learned that life doesn't always have a fairy tale ending. Sometimes the handsome prince has an anger problem, or a drinking problem, or he doesn't keep his wedding vows. Sometimes the good die young. So the crucifixion, it left Thomas with a lot of questions about life and God, and a lot of reasons to be cynical. But then a remarkable thing happened to him. He's coming back home one day, and the disciples, they run and they greet him, and they're like, Thomas, you are not going to believe this, but Jesus is alive. He appeared to us. We talked to him. We hung out with him. He's alive. Well, Thomas, he's understandably cynical, and I told you that we were going to be in John 20. We're going to go to that right now. And look at Thomas's response to this news that they had seen Jesus. We're going to start reading in verse 24. So John 20:24. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. And so the other disciples told him, we've seen the Lord. But he said to them, unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. What happened to that guy in chapter 11 who was willing to die with Jesus? Where'd that guy go? He's gone, right? Reality had set in, and cynicism had replaced his idealism. Thomas says, I don't believe whatever it was you saw. I don't believe that was Jesus. And unless I physically see the marks with the nails left in his hands, and I can put my finger in one of those holes, and if I could put my hand in his side, unless I can do that, I will never believe. I will not be hurt again. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, well, shame on me. Okay, now you might know how this story ends, right? Because Jesus appears to his disciples again, and this time, Thomas is with them. So let's look at verse 26. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Now, although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, peace be with you. And then he said to Thomas, put your finger here and see my hands. And put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. And Thomas answered him, my Lord and my God. And Jesus said to him, have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. All right, now 2 things stand out to me from this story. The first is that Jesus met Thomas where he was. Right? Jesus, he knew all of this disappointment that Thomas had been through, all the pain. He knew the things that Thomas had said. He knew that he had said, unless I could put my finger into his hand wounds, I will never believe. And yet, Jesus doesn't give him a hard time about that. He doesn't condemn him for that. He extends his arms and he says, Thomas, go ahead, man. There's nothing to be afraid of. Okay, he met him where he was. The second thing I notice is that Thomas doesn't take him up on it. Right? All of this cynicism that Thomas had of, man, unless I can put my finger in his wounds, I'll never believe. All of that melted away when he sees the risen Christ, and he never does it. And instead, he just responds, my Lord and my God, which is the strongest statement of faith in all of the Gospel of John. Throughout the Gospel of John, Jesus asks like a number of people, who do you say that I am? And Thomas is the only one who gets it right. I mean, it's not like John the Baptist doesn't, it's not Peter, not Lazarus, not John, the beloved disciple who wrote the book. The only person in the whole gospel who gets it right is Thomas. Thomas discovered what Greg Boyd talked about earlier. Even if you have a million things to be cynical about in life, if you have that one thing that you can be hopeful about, you can be an optimist. And when Thomas saw the resurrected Christ, he found that one thing. Now here we are, 2,000 years later, and evil is still very real. Sin and death are still very real. And I know that you probably have been hurt. And I know that you probably have a lot of reasons to be cynical. But here's the thing. Those things have been defeated. Right? And I love how Greg Boyd put it. He said they were defeated in principle on the cross, and now they're being defeated in actuality as the Holy Spirit works through the church and we're a force for good. And then one day they're going to be defeated finally when Christ returns. When Thomas encountered Jesus, he got his hope back, right? He realized that all of these experiences and all of these letdowns and all of these ways that life had not gone the way that he thought it would, that none of those things was the end of the story. And the same is true for you. No matter what you have experienced, none of those things gets the last word. Hey, Jesus gets the last word because the tomb is still empty and he is still alive. And this is proof to us that God is at work and that we have a future to hope in. Because of the resurrection, we can be optimists. And that leads me to the last thing I want to share, these last two verses I want to close with, verses 30 and 31. John says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you might have life in his name. John tells us that, Jesus did a lot of cool things in his life. I can't write them all down, but the ones I did write down, I wrote down for one reason. That you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing, you might have life in his name. Jesus was not the only one who was made alive on that first Easter. Through faith, we were made alive with him. And so we're going to end our time together, as we always do, with our time of response. And the band is going to come back up, and we're going to sing two more songs. And while we do that, we're going to celebrate the Lord's Supper together. And if this is your first time here, and you're like, well, this is a little bit scary for me, that's okay. It's an open table. You're free to come forward. If you don't want to, you don't have to. You can stay where you are, and you can worship. You can worship through singing, or you can just worship through listening. But while we worship and while we celebrate the Lord's Supper, I'd also love to pray for you. And so I will be standing right back there in that corner, and Gary will be standing right back there in that corner, and he'd love to pray for you as well. If there's something going on in your life, big or small, we'd love to pray for you. But specifically, if you've never trusted Christ, but something you've heard today really resonated with you, either maybe one of the lyrics to one of the songs we sang or something that we read out of the Bible, and there's something inside of you saying, this is true. Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. If you're hearing that voice inside you today, that's the voice of God. And he's calling you to himself. And if you've never trusted him, I'd love to let you know how you can today. And so, like I said, we'll be in the back of the room. I'd love to pray for you. Will you stand with me while we prepare for the Lord's Supper?